This is Montana. The people who live up here measure almost everything differently than the rest of the country does. And you don't realise how differently until you spend a little time out here. A short drive isn't short. A small town isn't small. A hard winter isn't hard, not by Montana standards. Out on the eastern plains, locals have a phrase for the settlements that finally went under. Once you hear it, you'll understand half of this state in a sentence. Up in the high country, they have a name for an animal almost nobody ever sees. And that name says more about Montana than any guidebook ever could. And once you start looking, the places themselves start adding up. There's a Cold War suburb out here with hundreds of empty houses. And most people couldn't point to it on a map. There's a mountain you can spot from 75 miles out, and the country couldn't tell you what it's called. There's a town up on the Highline where one family runs the only oil station. And they're not particularly bothered about that being unusual. Those are 3 of the places I had the hardest time leaving out. This is Montana, and you're about to see what most of the country's been missing for 100 years. In southwest Montana, the ground is quietly tearing itself apart, and it has been for a very long time. Cliff Lake formed right in that crack, pressed against sheer rock walls that didn't erode slowly, but snapped and dropped when the earth split open. Those walls are the actual exposed faces of the fault. Raw, unweathered rock that geologists study for signs of the next shift. And the fault is still moving, which means the lake is technically still growing. The Centennial Valley around it sits high enough that winters here are brutal. Cold that freezes the lake solid, yet the ground beneath never fully settles. Long before scientists arrived with instruments, the Shoshone and Bannock peoples travelled through this valley seasonally, using the same cliffs as landmarks across their hunting routes. On calm mornings, the water is so clear and still, it's hard to believe anything violent ever happened here, until you look up at the walls and remember what made them. But something small and fearless calls these icy inflows home. A little bird that found a way to solve the cold, not by avoiding it, but by diving straight in. The American dipper is the only songbird in North America that actually swims, not paddling at the surface, but walking along the bottom of fast-moving streams to hunt. A thick coat of waterproof feathers and a slowed heart rate underwater let it stay submerged long enough to pick insects straight off the stream bed. Even its nostrils seal shut on impact, turning this palm-sized bird into something closer to a tiny feathered submarine. A sliding membrane sweeps over each eye, like built-in goggles, so the moment it hits the water, it can already see its next meal. Feeding happens almost entirely below the surface. Caddisfly larvae, mayfly nymphs, small fish, and eggs taken as it shuffles along the riverbed in near zero visibility. Its song sounds surprisingly warm and musical for a bird that lives beside deafening whitewater, a rolling flute-like series of whistles and trills that carries over the noise of the current. Throughout the year, even in midwinter, it continues singing, likely to hold territory long before breeding begins. Somewhere nearby, a forgotten town is holding on to its last few pieces, a restored church, an old vault, and a whole lot of silence. Barber was never meant to be a real town, just a service stop on the Milwaukee Road Railroad, built to keep trains fueled and moving west. When the railroad left, everyone else did too, leaving nothing but concrete foundations pressed into the grass, like the outline of a life that used to be here. The old bank vault is still standing, too heavy to haul away, too stubborn to rot, a safe that outlasted everything it was meant to protect. One building, though, came back. Grace Lutheran Church was restored on the same ground where railroad workers and ranch families once crowded the pews. Out here, where neighbours could be miles apart, it wasn't just a place of worship. It was where people gathered, shared news, and stayed connected. Grace Lutheran wasn't built for a city crowd. It was built for people who might travel hours just to sit in a pew for one service. It doubled as a schoolroom, meeting hall and storm shelter, because when you're the only building around, you serve every purpose. But the prairie has its own kind of cathedral, and it wasn't built by anyone. Medicine Rocks is a field of sandstone boulders riddled with holes, arches, and tunnels, all shaped by wind and water over a stretch of time. The Lakota and Crow considered this place sacred, stopping here during long travels to pray, leave offerings, and carve messages into the rock for whoever came next. These rocks were a prayer site, a message board, and a compass all at once. And that tells a much bigger story about how native peoples didn't just pass through the land, they read it. The carvings here were instructions, warnings, and records left for the next traveller, sometimes read by people who arrived generations later. Sacred sites like this often sat at the edges of multiple tribal territories, neutral ground where even rival groups could stop and acknowledge something bigger than their own conflicts. Not far from here, a very different kind of place was also abandoned. Elkhorn, a silver mining town where a handful of buildings still stand, slowly losing the fight against time. It wasn't a rough camp of drifters, it was a real community, with families, a school, and regular dances held in the same halls that are still standing today. A diphtheria outbreak had already weakened the town before the silver gave out, taking enough lives that Elkhorn never fully recovered its footing, even in its own prime. When the silver market crashed, the exodus came fast. Homes were emptied, workshops cleared, and everyday life left behind almost mid-motion. What makes it unusual is not just that it failed, but how completely it stopped, as if the town simply paused and never resumed. Fraternity Hall and Gillian Hall are the only structures left, both built for gatherings, now maintained by Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks to keep them standing. But the mining story doesn't end here. Higher up, where the air gets thin and the tunnels go dark, the real cost of all that silver is still written into the rock. Alta Mine sits at high elevation, where the cold alone made the work brutal. Yet miners went in every day, into shafts that flooded and collapsed without warning. Inside, men hand-drilled through solid rock in passages so tight they could barely turn around, breathing dust that quietly destroyed lungs long before any cave-in had the chance to. Silver veins were wildly unpredictable. A shaft could yield a fortune one week and nothing the next, which is why so many men kept pushing deeper past any reasonable point. Long after the mining stopped, the contamination remained, and waterways near sites like this are still being monitored and treated today. The mountain is slowly taking the site back, and somewhere in the trees growing over it, a bird that's nearly impossible to spot has made itself completely at home. Ruffed grouse is a disappearing act with feathers. Its bark-patterned coat merges so perfectly into the forest floor that you can stand right next to one and never know it. When a predator gets too close, it doesn't slip away quietly. It explodes into the air with a sudden burst loud enough to startle almost anything nearby, including hikers who should have seen it coming. Every winter, it grows small comb-like projections on its toes that work like snowshoes. A seasonal upgrade, it quietly sheds each spring. The grouse has snowbanks and forests to rely on. Meanwhile, the Mormon fritillary just has a short summer, a few wildflowers, and a very tight schedule. This small orange butterfly lives only in alpine meadows, where summers are so short it spends most of its life beneath the snow, waiting for a few weeks of warmth. On cold mornings it can't fly at all. It sits with wings spread flat, angling itself toward the sun like a tiny solar panel, warming up before the day's work begins. They're so vulnerable that one bad summer, one late frost, or one meadow lost to encroaching trees can wipe out an entire local population with no backup plan. Its caterpillars feed almost entirely on violets, hardy little plants that grow well in disturbed soil, making old mining slopes near Alpine surprisingly good habitat. Not far from here, the ground gave up something far more valuable than violets, and the town that grew around it is still standing today. Virginia City exploded into existence after gold was found in Alder Gulch, pulling in thousands of people so fast that the town had saloons, hotels and a newspaper before it had proper streets. The miners made the headlines, but everyone else made the money. Shop owners, laundry workers, gamblers and freight drivers charging whatever they wanted because there was no competition. Law was so scarce that a vigilante group formed and began hanging suspected criminals with trials that lasted roughly as long as it took to find a rope. It never fully died. It slowed, emptied, but stayed intact enough that walking its main street today feels less like a museum and more like a town paused in time. Up north, something far bigger and far older is waiting, and it's slowly disappearing. Glacier National Park was carved by massive ice sheets that ground through the mountains, and left behind valleys so perfectly U-shaped they look machined. The ice that gave this place its name is still present, but only in fragments now, retreating so quickly that scientists expect most of it to vanish within a generation. That loss has created an odd effect. People now come to see the glaciers before they're gone, turning climate change into an accidental and uncomfortable tourism pitch. The Going to the Sun road cuts through the park over a mountain pass, carved into sheer cliffs to reach terrain that would otherwise be unreachable. It's only open a few months a year. Winter snow buries it under depths that can exceed a 2-story building, and clearing it is a months-long operation before a single car gets through. Early lodges in the park were built for wealthy train passengers, designed to feel untamed while still offering full comfort and scenic spectacle. Today, the park gets so crowded that parking fills before sunrise, and a vehicle reservation system now controls access just to stop the place from being visited into ruin. The Blackfoot people called this the backbone of the world, which turns out to be geologically accurate, since the rock here is among the oldest exposed stone on the continent. Of all the animals here, none commands the country quite like the grizzly bear. Glacier holds one of the densest grizzly populations in the lower 48 states, and the bears here are not afraid of anything, including the amount tourists who arrive every summer. Their diet is almost impressively flexible. Berries, fish, ground squirrels dug straight from the dirt. And on warm nights, they climb above the tree line to feast on moths hiding in the rocks. A grizzly's bite is strong enough to crush a bowling ball, yet they're capable of delicately picking individual berries off a branch without damaging the stem. Despite their size, they move quietly, which is exactly why trail encounters can happen with almost no warning. They are strong, confident swimmers, crossing fast, cold rivers without hesitation. And they genuinely seem to enjoy it, often lingering in the water well past the point of necessity. What makes them truly remarkable isn't the strength, it's the memory. A grizzly remembers exactly where it found food and returns to the same spots years later with near-perfect accuracy. By late summer, they're eating enormous amounts daily, building fat for a winter sleep so profound their heart rate drops to just a few beats per minute. Mothers raise cubs for up to 3 years and are, by a wide margin, the most dangerous bears in the park. Cubs play wrestle constantly, and mothers actively encourage it, because every tumble and mock fight is quietly teaching them the strength and coordination they'll need to survive alone. Below the peaks, the meltwater goes somewhere, and most of it runs into the Flathead River. It drains directly out of Glacier National Park, carrying some of the cleanest, coldest water in the country. So clear in places you can read the riverbed from the bank. That clarity isn't just beautiful, it's functional. Bull trout and west slope cutthroat trout need exactly this kind of water to survive, and the Flathead is one of the last places they still do. Bull trout are a living water quality test. If they're present, the river is genuinely healthy. If they disappear, something has gone wrong upstream. Three mountain forks feed this river system, creating waters so intact that scientists use them as a baseline for what healthy rivers should look like. That hasn't stopped pressure from building. Proposed mining operations upstream have sparked one of the longest-running environmental battles in Montana history. Just down the valley, the same cold, clear water settles into something still. A lake so calm and reflective, it looks like the mountains are growing in two directions at once. Lake McDonald is the largest lake inside the park, and its bottom is covered in stones that look like a painter's palette. Red, green, purple and gold, visible straight through the water from the surface. Those colours aren't random. Each stone reflects the iron and oxygen present when it formed, turning the lake bed into a geological colour chart. That remarkable clarity exists because almost nothing grows in the water. The cold, nutrient-poor conditions support very little algae. Even in summer, the lake remains dangerously cold, and hypothermia can set in far faster than most people expect. Up where the air thins and the snow never fully leaves, one of the park's most studied glaciers still hangs on. Grinnell Glacier sits high above the valley, and for a long time, it seemed like the kind of thing that would simply always be there, like the mountains holding it. Old photographs show ice that once filled the entire upper basin. What remains today is only a fraction of that former mass. If warming continues at this pace, Grinnell could disappear entirely within a few decades. Every stream, lake and river below depends on that melting ice, which puts the entire downstream ecosystem on borrowed time. Even here, inside a natural bowl of shade, elevation, and trapped cold air, the glacier continues to retreat, revealing how dramatically the surrounding climate has already changed. Many hikers describe the experience as unsettling, not because of the altitude, but because the glacier looks so diminished against the scale of the terrain around it. The water sliding off that vanishing ice has to go somewhere, and on the way down, it forms Grinnell Falls. It drops straight off a cliff, carved by the same glacier that feeds them. As the ice retreats, the falls grow louder, as if the mountain is pouring out its last reserves before it's gone for good. Nature's strangest farewell. Just above the spray, on a ledge nothing else would attempt, a mountain goat has already claimed the best view in the park. Here they live on cliffs so steep that most predators simply can't follow. The rock face isn't just home, it's a defence system. Their hooves are built for this. A hard outer edge for grip and a soft inner pad like a rubber sole. A mountain goat's body is built front heavy on purpose, with a thick muscular chest and shoulders that act as a counterweight when climbing near vertical surfaces. Kids, the actual baby goats, are up and climbing within hours of being born, navigating ledges at an age when most animals can barely stand. They eat whatever grows on the rock face, sparse grass, moss, lichen. Up here, competition is nearly non-existent simply because so few animals can reach it. Their white coat isn't just for warmth. It matches snow and pale rock, hiding them against the terrain even when they stand completely still. These animals are also surprisingly aggressive toward each other. Those short, sharp horns aren't just for show, and disputes over ledge space can turn serious fast. Males and females live separately for most of the year, only coming together briefly during mating season, before returning to different sections of the mountain. In summer, they descend to valley floors for natural salt licks, chasing minerals their high elevation diet lacks. Interestingly, mountain goats aren't true goats. They're more closely related to antelopes, making their cliff climbing ability even more unexpected. On the eastern side of the park, St. Mary Lake holds one of the most photographed scenes in the entire American West. Its water takes on a vivid, almost unnatural blue-green, created by glacial flour. Rock ground so fine by ice that it remains suspended and scatters light in a way that looks artificial. Strong winds funnel down the valley with nothing to slow them, shifting the lake from glassy calm to whitecaps in minutes, and often catching boaters off guard. In the middle sits Wild Goose Island, a small tree-covered rock that looks as if it was deliberately placed there. A short distance away, Running Eagle Falls emerges from a hole halfway down a cliff, with a second drop spilling straight over the top. 2 falls, 1 rock. The cliff absorbs water from the stream above, channels it through the stone, and pushes it out through a natural opening lower down, essentially turning solid rock into a pipe. It was named after a Blackfoot woman warrior, Running Eagle, who is said to have come to this place to pray and receive visions before leading war raids. In high water seasons, the upper fall completely hides the lower opening. It only reveals itself when the flow drops enough to expose it, which means most visitors never see both at once. The animals that survive these high cliffs aren't all built like mountain goats. Some are short, fat, and remarkably loud. Alpine marmot is essentially a giant ground squirrel, weighing as much as a small dog, living inside burrows dug beneath boulder fields in Glacier's high basins. They eat grasses, flowers, roots, and berries, but they're surprisingly selective, choosing the most calorie-dense plants available and ignoring everything else. Through the brief alpine summer, they focus almost entirely on feeding, steadily doubling their body weight to carry them through months underground. They have a fully developed underground system, with burrows divided into separate chambers for sleeping and waste. A marmot's teeth never stop growing, so they have to keep chewing constantly to wear them down. Surprisingly, they can also predict weather changes before they arrive, retreating underground ahead of incoming storms. What they're famous for is the whistle. When a hawk passes or a grizzly gets too close, one marmot stands on a rock and lets out a piercing alarm scream that carries across the entire slope. At that signal, the whole colony freezes, then vanishes underground in seconds. They are arguably nature's loudest rodent, sleeping more than half the year beneath the surface without waking once. Marmots sunbathe on purpose, stretched flat on warm rocks to warm up after cold nights. More beachgoer than Alpine survivor. Down the valley, someone looked at all this and thought, people should be able to enjoy this with room service. Many Glacier Hotel was built in 1915 on the shore of Swift Current Lake, styled like a Swiss chalet, so visitors would feel like they'd reached the Alps without leaving Montana. It worked almost too well, pulling in thousands of guests each season, all arriving by train with no roads required. Dark brown wood siding, Swiss-style balconies, carved brackets, wide eaves, and flower boxes run along the entire lakeside face. Even after renovation, the hotel still has no television or air conditioning in its rooms, by choice, to preserve its 1915 atmosphere. But Glacier's real surprises aren't in hotel lobbies. They're deeper in the trees, where a waterfall drops in near silence, far off the trail and easy to miss. Virginia Falls tumbles over a stepped rock face, fed entirely by snowmelt, running strong for only a few months before slowing to almost nothing by late summer. At the base, the mist keeps everything permanently wet, cool even on warm days, where moss and ferns crowd the spray zone. After heavy snowmelt years, the falls run so loud you can hear them well before they come into view. Far across the state, in the dry Badlands country of eastern Montana, the road rolls past a place called Westmore. It was never really a town, just a rough supply stop for ranchers, rail workers and travellers, lasting only until the railroads rerouted, the ranching economy shifted, and people moved on. What's left are a few ageing structures slowly returning to the earth, weathered wood, rusted hardware, and the kind of silence only abandoned places carry. Locals still call these edge of Badlands stops places where the land won back, where the prairie reclaimed whatever people left behind. Further west, the dry country ends and the water returns, louder and faster than anything the Badlands ever produced. Kootenai Falls is one of the largest undammed waterfalls in the American Northwest, dropping over exposed rock with enough force to shake the ground beneath your feet. Below the falls, the river moves so violently that early engineers building routes across Montana had to reroute roads and rail lines miles out of the way just to avoid it. Crossing nearby means taking a narrow swinging bridge suspended above the churning water, swaying with every step and every gust off the river. All that permanent spray turns out to be prime hunting ground, not for bears or eagles, but for something far smaller and considerably faster. Dragonflies and damselflies patrol the mist zones around Kootenai Falls, using the constant moisture that keeps smaller insects swarming close to the surface. One of the easiest ways to tell the two apart is posture. Dragonflies hold their wings flat and wide at rest, while damselflies fold theirs neatly back along the body like a plane coming into land. Despite spending most of their adult life in the air, dragonflies begin as underwater hunters, living below the surface for months before ever taking their first flight. The dragonfly is one of the most accurate hunters on the planet, catching over 9 out of 10 targets it chases mid-air, a success rate that makes most predators look careless. Instead of chasing prey the way most hunters do, it calculates where the target is going and flies directly to that point, intercepting it before the insect even knows what happened. Its eyes take up most of the head and wrap almost all the way around, giving the dragonfly a field of view that covers nearly everything at once, essentially a flying security camera. When mating, a male dragonfly aggressively guards his partner, hovering directly over her while she lays eggs to keep rival males away. Damselflies share the same hunting strategy, but are noticeably slimmer, slower, and far more delicate looking. The dragonfly's quieter, less aggressive cousin. They also tend to stay lower, hunting just above the water's surface, where the smallest midges and gnats collect in dense clouds near the mist. Their mating behaviour is one of the stranger sights in the insect world. The male and female lock together mid-flight, forming a loop shape that can remain connected while still flying. Further into the mountains, Castletown tells the story of what happens when thousands of people rush in for silver, make a lot of noise, and then disappear almost overnight. It rose fast after silver was struck at the Cumberland mine, drawing in saloons, brothels, boarding houses, and crowds that quickly filled what had been empty mountain land. At its peak, it was loud, crowded, and running entirely on the assumption that the silver would never stop coming. When ore values dropped and the Cumberland mine shut down, the camp didn't fade slowly. It emptied fast, with residents leaving furniture, tools, and belongings behind. What's left are scattered stone ruins being swallowed by the mountainside, walls without roofs, foundations without floors, and rusted objects half buried in the ground. West of here, the Mission Mountains have been standing through all of it, completely indifferent to boom, bust, and everything in between. The slopes rise fast and steep, covered in dense forest and cut by narrow valleys that can swallow sound, light, and even entire trails without warning. Much of this range borders tribal lands where access is tightly controlled and large areas remain closed to protect both culture and terrain. Getting through these mountains isn't straightforward. Routes fade, reappear, and sometimes vanish, forcing travellers to rely on memory as much as maps. This is where backcountry hunting still runs strong, with people pushing far into the range each season, carrying everything in and only what they can pack out. Camps are often set far from any road, where days pass without seeing another person, and the only sign of human presence might be a faint trail or an old fire ring. The animal that lives at the very edge of these mountains is one of the rarest creatures in the lower 48, the wolverine. It looks like a small bear, but moves non-stop, covering huge stretches of the Mission Mountains without slowing down. In a single day, it can cross miles of steep slopes, heavy snow, and broken terrain that stops most animals cold. Its wide paws act like snowshoes, letting it glide over soft drifts instead of sinking. With such wide territory, wolverines rarely encounter one another, each roaming an immense range across the high country. Even so, sightings are extremely rare, and most people here never see one at all. Locals often call it a ghost of the high country, always moving and almost never seen, leaving only tracks behind. It survives mostly by scavenging, using a powerful bite to break into frozen carcasses other predators can't open. In quieter moments, it caches food beneath the snow, relying on the cold as a natural freezer for later. Known for its attitude, a wolverine will challenge much larger animals just to steal a meal. Despite their size, they can climb trees, scale cliffs, and even steal food from traps, earning a reputation as one of the most stubborn survivors in the mountains. High on the same range, a tall waterfall pours straight down through old-growth timber, fed by the snowmelt of the upper Mission peaks. Mission Falls runs hardest in late spring, when an entire winter's worth of snow releases at once and sends water crashing down in a single concentrated drop. The forest around it stays wet long after peak flow passes, keeping the ground soft, the moss thick, and the air noticeably cooler than anywhere on the lower trail. Far to the north and east, where the prairie flattens out, and the Great Northern Railway once cut a straight line across Montana, the highway slips past a tiny place called Glacier. It existed because of grain, a stop where wheat was loaded, stored and shipped by train, and for a time its main street held everything a traveller needed, from storefronts to supply shops. Then rail traffic slowed, routes shifted, and the steady flow of grain and people vanished, leaving weathered structures on an empty road, doors shut, windows dark, signs fading. Back across the state, west of the mountains, lies the largest natural freshwater lake anywhere in the country west of the Mississippi River. Flathead Lake is so large it shapes its own local weather, keeping nearby air warmer in winter and cooler in summer. That climate moderation extends to the shoreline, where orchards manage to grow in conditions that would be too harsh just a few miles inland. Cherry trees do especially well here, lining parts of the lake with fruit that depends on that steady climate. The water stays unusually clear, often revealing the bottom near shore and giving the surface a glass-like look on calm days. On those same calm days, the lake opens up into a broad expanse of navigable water, supporting everything from small fishing skiffs to full sailing vessels on the same surface. It draws boaters from across the region, with enough open water to support everything from small fishing skiffs to full sailing vessels on the same surface. In the east, tucked into the little Rocky Mountains, sits a tiny mountain town with a darker chapter. Zortman grew around gold mining, pulling in workers and businesses, but when mining slowed and environmental damage mounted, much of it faded while the town never fully emptied. Instead of becoming a ghost town, it became something stranger, a half-living place where a few residents remain surrounded by fading motels, empty storefronts and ageing buildings. Some structures still stand in usable condition, while others sit abandoned right next door, creating a mix of life and decay along the same short strip of road. Beyond these mountains, the ground levels out, and the CSKT Bison range stretches across open country, where herds now move again. This land was once nearly emptied of bison, pushed to the edge of extinction, before careful protection brought them back to these same plains. Today, the range is managed under tribal oversight, where wildlife stewardship is guided not just by science, but by generations of cultural knowledge. The goal is not just to keep animals alive, but to restore balance, allowing the grass, soil and water to recover alongside the herds. Bison here are not treated as attractions, but as part of a living system that once supported entire communities. The land still carries signs of that connection, with old travel routes, hunting grounds, and open plains that were shaped by both people and animals moving together. Unlike fenced pastures elsewhere, this range gives the herds space to behave naturally, spreading out, regrouping, and shaping the ground beneath them. Seasonal changes still guide movement here, with grass growth, weather, and water all influencing where the herds go next. What's happening now is less about rebuilding, and more about continuing something that was interrupted, a return to a rhythm that never fully disappeared. Moving through it all are the American bison, steady, powerful, and right where they belong. A full-grown bull can weigh over a ton, yet still move with surprising speed and agility when it needs to, covering ground faster than most people expect from an animal that size. That combination of mass and movement shows up across the herd, where bison pivot through open grasslands with an ease that contradicts their bulk. Here, the herds move across open grasslands in loose bands, grazing constantly and trimming the ground in ways that actually improve the grass for everything that follows. They mostly eat grasses, but they will also chew on shrubs and woody plants when food is scarce. Their tongues are rough and strong, able to pull up tough grass that many other animals can't handle. Calves are born a reddish-orange colour, earning them the nickname Red Dogs, and can stand and run within hours of birth. During the rut, males clash head-on, with enough force to be heard from a long distance, competing for dominance in contests that can last several minutes. Where bison roll and churn the earth into dust wallows, shallow depressions form that collect rainwater, creating small wet patches that dozens of other species depend on. They also use their massive heads like snowplows in winter, swinging side to side to clear snow and reach the frozen grass underneath. In the wooded slopes and broken coulees of this same country, another large animal moves almost completely unseen, the puma. Also called cougar, mountain lion or panther, it is the largest cat in North America that can still purr like a house cat. Most people who pass through the range will never see one, even if the animal is watching from just a few yards away. a single male may roam more than 100 square miles, moving through mountains, forests and open ground, across a territory so massive it rarely leaves any clear trace of its passage. Pumas are ambush hunters, staying hidden until the last second, then exploding forward with a burst of speed that leaves prey no time to react. Here they prey mostly on deer, but will take smaller animals like rabbits, raccoons, and even large birds when the opportunity is there. Their padded paws turn each step into near silence, erasing the sound of movement even at close range. They can leap up to 40 feet in a single bound, launch straight up cliffs, and sprint faster than a racehorse over short distances. Their strength is just as impressive, able to drag prey much heavier than themselves, and even carry it up into trees to keep it safe. Unlike most big cats, pumas communicate without a roar, instead using whistles, chirps, and screams that sound nothing like what most people expect from an apex predator. Between hunts, they spend long stretches doing almost nothing, draped across a warm rock ledge in the sun, looking completely unbothered by the world below. But the biggest hunts here were not done by predators like this. They happened at a place called First Peoples Buffalo Jump State Park. Here, a long sandstone cliff rises above the plains, positioned perfectly for one of the most coordinated hunting methods ever used. Entire groups worked together, guiding herds across the grasslands and slowly building pressure until the animals ran straight toward the edge. At the final moment, the herd surged forward, and up to hundreds could go over the cliff in seconds, turning a single hunt into enough food and materials to last for months. Nothing was wasted: meat for food, hides for shelter and clothing, bones for tools, all used carefully to support daily life. This system fed people for generations, but Montana's economy eventually shifted. Places like Grant Course Ranch would later show how wealth came from raising animals instead of hunting them. It became one of the largest cattle operations in the West, managing thousands of head across open range that ran for miles. When the gold rush slowed and mining camps emptied, ranching filled the gap, turning grazing, hay storage, and cattle drives into the new foundation. Cowboys lived in bunkhouses, spending months on the range with little more than bedrolls, basic supplies, and whatever they could carry on horseback. The ranch still preserves the original barns, corrals, and quarters, showing exactly how the operation worked day to day. As it held its ground, Lolo Town made its living as the gateway between settled valleys and the rough mountain passes beyond. Positioned at the mouth of Lolo Pass, the community became a natural stopping point for anyone heading west toward the Bitterroot Range or into Idaho. Freight teams, outfitters and road travellers all passed through here, stocking up on supplies before tackling the forested routes that could take days to cross. The town never grew large, but it didn't need to. Its value came from location, not size. When highways replaced wagon roads, Lolo adapted, supporting a steady flow of traffic that still moves through the same corridor. People described the town as a place where people always stopped, but rarely stayed, and a transition point that kept business steady without ever booming. The forests surrounding Lolo remained thick and active, with wildlife moving freely between the valley floor and the higher slopes. Among those animals, one has figured out how to live in both worlds, slipping between the wild edges and the quiet margins of town after dark. The red fox is one of the most adaptable predators on the planet, equally comfortable in forests, farmland, suburbs, and even city parks. Around here they move through brushy creek edges, hayfields and residential backyards, stalking mice, voles and small birds with remarkable precision. Their hearing is so sharp they can detect a mouse moving under a foot of snow, pinpointing the location before launching into a high-arcing pounce that lands directly on target. That hunting leap, called mousing, can send a fox several feet into the air before it dives headfirst into the snow or grass. Despite their size, they are incredibly fast, reaching speeds over 30 miles per hour in short bursts when chasing prey or escaping danger. Beyond hunting, foxes readily switch to whatever food is easiest to find, feeding on berries, insects, eggs, and even scraps pulled from garbage bins. They are solitary hunters most of the year, but during breeding season pairs work together to raise kits in dens dug into hillsides or tucked under old structures. Kits are born blind and helpless, staying underground for weeks before venturing out to learn hunting skills through play and practice. They sometimes form small family groups where older siblings stay behind to help raise the next litter, acting as babysitters and teachers for the kits. Red foxes communicate with a range of sounds, from sharp barks to eerie screams that can carry across the valley at night, startling anyone unfamiliar with the noise. Further up the valley, past the last porchlight, the trees close in, and one of western Montana's largest forest systems begins. Lolo National Forest spans cedar valleys, wet mountain ravines, and remote corridors that were once the only routes through this part of the West. Early explorers and trappers who crossed these forests relied on river knowledge, horseback trails, and careful timing to avoid being caught in heavy snow or spring floods. The forest gets enough rainfall to keep the ground wet and the undergrowth thick, creating conditions where trails can vanish under moss and fallen timber in a single season. Getting lost here was a real risk, with dense cover blocking visibility and few reliable landmarks to guide the way. Some routes were passed down through generations, memorised rather than mapped, and known only to those who had travelled them before. Today, parts of the forest remain just as difficult to move through, with sections accessible only on foot or horseback, and no cell service for miles. Beyond these slopes, Holland Lake rests in a clearing, calm and surprisingly accessible compared to everything around it. It sits at the foot of the Swan Range, with sharp granite peaks rising right out of the water. The water stays cold year-round, fed by snowmelt from the ridges above, and clears enough in summer to reveal the bottom far below the surface. A small lodge near the shore has operated for generations, offering one of the few places in this forest where travellers can sleep indoors without driving back to town. The lake allows motorboats and water skiing, making it one of the few alpine lakes in the area where high-speed recreation is permitted alongside quieter paddling. It is actually part of Flathead National Forest, not Lolo National Forest, though the two forests share bordering boundaries in this region. Far north along the Highline, where the prairie runs out of patience and the wind has nothing to slow it down, the town of Devon barely registers anymore. It grew as a service stop where farm traffic, oil workers and travellers could fuel up and move on, enough to keep a small cluster of buildings occupied for a while. When farm machinery improved and fewer hands were needed on the land, the steady flow of people slowed and younger generations left for larger towns with more to offer. What's left today is a single family, an old oil station, and a few structures that have stopped pretending to be anything other than what they are. Down on the Missouri River, Fort Benton sits along a wide bend that once changed the course of American expansion. For a period in the mid-1800s, this small river town was the furthest inland point a steamboat could reliably reach, making it the last stop before everything moved by wagon. At its peak, dozens of steamboats unloaded here each season, carrying flour, rifles, and entire families starting over with nothing but what they could hold. The town exploded so fast it became one of the most dangerous stops on the northern frontier, with traders, fur companies, and whiskey runners packed into the same few muddy blocks. It was once called the bloodiest block in the West, a single stretch of saloons and trading posts where violence was so common that law enforcement barely bothered keeping count. When the railroads arrived and made river shipping unnecessary, Fort Benton lost its edge almost overnight, leaving stone warehouses and levee walls still standing along the water today. The original adobe fort that gave the town its name was partially dismantled by its own residents, who used the bricks to build homes and shops, recycling their own history. Meanwhile, the story of St. Marie is different. No slow bleed, no gradual goodbye, just hundreds of empty homes left behind all at once. When Glasgow Air Force Base closed in the late 1960s, the community built around it lost its purpose within months. Streets that once held families, a school, and a full neighbourhood of services simply went quiet. Everything's still standing, just empty. What makes it strange isn't the abandonment itself, it's the scale. An entire suburb, frozen midlife, infrastructure outlasting the people by decades. What happened above ground in St. Marie is unusual enough. But southwest of here, what happened below ground is something else, entirely. Lewis and Clark Caverns is Montana's oldest state park, and the cave system inside is one of the largest known limestone networks in the entire Northwest. Two hunters stumbled across the entrance in 1892, almost certainly with no idea they'd just found one of the most decorated cave systems in the country. Inside, the temperature stays naturally cool year-round. Stepping in on a hot summer day feels less like geology and more like someone left a very large door open to a refrigerator. The guided tour covers 2 miles entirely on foot, with passages low enough to crouch, squeeze, and occasionally waddle through. Every December, the park runs candlelight-only tours, the closest modern visitors get to experiencing the cave the way those first hunters did. The caverns are so dark and undisturbed that some species have quietly made them home, including one, barely the size of a hand, that has been here for a very long time. The Townsend's big-eared bat has ears nearly a third the length of its entire body. Proportionally, that's the equivalent of a person walking around with ears past their shoulders. When it sleeps, those ears fold neatly against its head, but the moment it wakes, they unfurl like a pair of radar dishes, locking onto a signal. In that darkness, sound becomes everything. Even the faint brush of a moth's wings against a leaf is enough to reveal its position. A single bat can pluck a moth clean off a tree without ever touching the branch, navigating entirely by the reflections of its own calls. This kind of precision allows it to function better in near total darkness than most animals do in daylight. Even a brief human disturbance during winter can force them to burn critical energy reserves, putting survival at risk before spring arrives. Outside these caves, the land pulls back and something far bigger takes over. A flat-topped volcanic butte, rising alone from the open plains like it has something to prove. Square Butte isn't the result of an eruption. Magma pushed up beneath the surface, hardened without ever breaking through, and waited while everything around it eroded away. What's left is a stone fortress, sheer-sided and flat-topped, rising over 2,000 feet above the plains with no foothills, no gradual build-up, just flat ground and then that. On a clear day, it's visible from nearly 75 miles out, meaning travellers crossing central Montana could track it for hours before ever getting close. The cliff faces also pull in golden eagles and prairie falcons each season, riding the updrafts off those sheer walls to hunt the grasslands below without burning much energy. It looks permanent and unshakable, but the same erosion that exposed it is still working on it, slowly and invisibly, one season at a time. Directly beneath it, in the shadow of all that stone, a small community took root, borrowing the butte's name and, in many ways, its quiet sense of being completely on its own. Square Butte community grew as a farming and ranching stop, the kind of place that existed because the surrounding land was productive enough to justify staying. At its peak, it supported a school, a post office, and enough families to hold the community together across the wide surrounding ranches. One of its strangest details was the school, a single building that educated children who travelled miles for class, until better roads and larger schools pulled younger generations away. Far across the eastern plains, the kind of place travellers used to stop for gas and a sandwich is barely visible through the grass anymore. Vandalia was a small service town built around passing traffic. The moment that traffic found a better route, the reason to stop disappeared with it. Two old gas pumps still stand outside what used to be a station, leaning slightly, the kind of red and white you only see in old photographs now. A weathered school sits nearby, an empty wagon parked beside it, and a child's swing set with the chains still hanging but the seat long gone, and the prairie filling in the rest. Not every Montana town left quietly. Bannock, Montana's first territorial capital, had a much louder and messier exit. It started with gold discovered in a nearby creek, pulling thousands of people into this remote valley faster than any law could follow. At its peak, it was the most important settlement in the territory, a place where fortunes were made in weeks and lost just as fast. The problem was that the man appointed to keep order was, by most accounts, running the criminal operation himself, a sheriff linked to robbery and murder while wearing a badge. Locals eventually stopped waiting for outside help and formed their own vigilante group, tracking down offenders and carrying out justice with a speed that left no room for appeals. More than 20 men were hanged within weeks, including the sheriff himself, in one of the most dramatic episodes of frontier justice in the American West. Even today, the original courthouse, jail, hotel, and saloon still stand in surprisingly good shape, preserved exactly as they were when the gold ran out. The gold is long gone, but the Clark Fork River to the west has been quietly doing its own work, shaping wetlands, fisheries, and marsh habitat across the mountain valleys. For centuries, indigenous communities used it as a key fishing route, reading its seasonal rhythms like a map, knowing exactly when and where the fish would run. The river became so contaminated from decades of copper mining runoff, then underwent one of the largest cleanups, removing toxic sediment and restoring fish that had long been gone. Today, the Clark Fork supports healthy brown and rainbow trout populations, drawing anglers from across the country to water that not long ago couldn't support much at all. Sharing these same banks is a bird so perfectly built for muddy riverbanks that it practically disappears into them, the Wilson snipe, probing the shoreline one careful inch at a time. That long bill isn't just for digging. The tip can open independently underground, feeling for worms and insects without the bird ever seeing what it's grabbing. At dusk along the river, a soft trembling hoot drifts down from somewhere overhead, and no matter how hard you look, you won't find the singer. That sound isn't a call at all. It comes from air rushing over its tail feathers in a dive, each feather vibrating at a different frequency to layer tones like a wind instrument. The snipe is essentially playing itself like a flute, performing a love song high above the marsh that no other bird can replicate. Sliding between the rocks and reeds of these same waters, the North American river otter treats the Clark Fork less like home and more like a personal playground. Built for water in almost every way, its body is streamlined, its ears and nostrils seal shut underwater, and its webbed feet make it faster in the current than most fish expect. It can hold its breath for several minutes, chasing fish and crayfish through the darker bends of the watershed where most predators simply can't follow. What separates it from other hunters isn't just speed. It can change direction underwater almost instantly, cutting tight corners in side channels without losing momentum. Those whiskers are sensitive enough to detect a fish through water pressure alone, which means hunting in complete darkness is less of a challenge and more of a Tuesday. Otters along the Clark Fork use the same entry points repeatedly, wearing smooth paths into muddy banks that look almost deliberate, because they are. Young ones learn every hunting technique through play, which is convenient because they appear to be having an absolutely fantastic time doing it. Families stay together through the first year, mothers teaching pups every skill they'll need to survive a river system still finding its way back from decades of damage. Not far away, a 3-story school rises from the open plains with no town around it anymore. Just Venada, the fuel pumps, and everything the last residents left behind. The school is the kind of building that stops you mid-drive. 3 full stories tall, standing completely alone on flat open land with nothing around it for miles. Venada grew along the Milwaukee Road rail line, one of many tiny settlements kept alive by freight and farms, and when both faded, the school was one of the last things left. Where the plains end and 5 valleys meet, Missoula built itself around the one thing Venada never had: a reason for everyone to keep showing up. The geography did most of the work. Wagon routes, rail lines, logging operations, and river access all converged at the same point. Logging drove the early economy, with surrounding forests feeding sawmills that reshaped entire hillsides within a generation. The University of Montana arrived early and shifted the city's identity from a purely industrial hub into something more complicated and considerably harder to define. Missoula sits in a natural air basin where winter cold traps smoke in the valley, turning it into one of the smokiest places in the country during the logging era. Right downtown, surrounded by brick storefronts and old hotels, rises one of the most beautiful churches in the entire West. St. Francis Xavier was built by Jesuit missionaries who had already spent decades establishing missions across the Northwest. It was designed in the Romanesque Revival style, with semicircular arches over every window and door, small buttresses along the walls, and a single bell tower. The church served growing immigrant and working communities who arrived with the railroads and mills, and for many, it was the first truly permanent building they had ever entered. It has survived fires, floods, and the kind of urban development that demolished most of what was built around it. Savoy, further along the plains, didn't get murals or a steeple, just an old bank vault, a fading schoolhouse, and the quiet that follows when everyone leaves. It was never meant to be a city. It existed to support nearby homesteads, a small cluster of services that made sense only as long as the farms kept running and the families kept coming. A bank vault and abandoned schoolhouse are strange things to leave behind in a place this small, both built by a community that fully expected the next generation to stay. When farm consolidation shifted the balance and larger towns became easier to reach, the reason to stop in Savoy disappeared, and the people followed shortly after. The Missouri River leads to Lombard next, where two once important rail routes met, and left behind a hotel, a school, and a general store at a crossing that time forgot. It existed for one reason: trains had to stop here, and wherever they stopped, people, freight and money followed, prompting a hotel, school, and store. At its most active, the junction supported a functioning community built entirely around the rhythm of arriving and departing rail traffic, a place that only made sense in motion. When the routes were consolidated and trains no longer needed to pause here, Lombard didn't decline gradually. It simply stopped being necessary almost overnight. East along the Missouri, Fort Peck Dam turned an entire river into one of the largest reservoirs on Earth, and it did it on purpose. Construction began at the height of the Great Depression, when the federal government needed a project big enough to employ thousands and bold enough to justify the cost. At its peak, more than 10,000 workers were on site, and a temporary city of families, theatres and shops sprang up around the construction almost overnight. The reservoir it created stretches so far across eastern Montana that it has more shoreline than the entire coast of California. From one of the most controlled parts of Montana, we head south into one of the least, Custer-Gallatin National Forest, where the mountains answer to nobody. The terrain here is geologically restless: volcanic leftovers, earthquake-carved basins and alpine lakes all sharing the same protected system. Camping, fishing and horseback routes aren't side activities here. They're how most people experience a forest too large and too wild to appreciate any other way. Hebgen Lake sits just beyond the forest boundary, and its story begins not with water, but with the ground beneath it giving way in one catastrophic moment. A massive earthquake struck just after midnight, dropping an entire section of the shoreline nearly 2 stories down and sending a wall of water crashing through the valley below. Nearby, a mountainside collapsed entirely, burying a campground under tens of millions of tons of rock, and the scar is still visible from the road today. Afterward, the lake began sloshing back and forth like water in a bowl, a rare event called a seiche, with waves continuing for hours after the shaking stopped. Gliding across that calm surface, the western grebe is often the first bird you notice, elegant, focused, and already hunting. Beneath that grace is one of the most precise divers in North America, capable of stabbing fish underwater with its bill like a spear, faster than the eye can follow. What really sets this bird apart is its courtship display, where 2 grebes run across the water side by side, fully upright, at full speed, as if gravity simply forgot about them. Pairs that run together tend to stay together, coordinating fishing trips and raising chicks on the parent's back while still swimming. Those chicks stay tucked under the wings for weeks, sometimes riding along even as the parent dives underwater. Out on the open plains, Kevintown waits, a scattering of idle stations, grain structures, and railroad relics that outlasted the industry that built them. Kevin was never large, but the nearby refinery kept enough traffic moving through to hold the place together until it shut down and the businesses around it slowly disappeared. A handful of people still remain, keeping the post office running, working the grain elevator, and staying put in a place most travellers assume was abandoned long ago. The plains have always had a way of settling things the hard way, and nowhere proves that more than Little Bighorn Battlefield, just down the road. A cavalry force rode into a valley expecting a small encampment, and instead found one of the largest gatherings of native warriors ever assembled on the northern plains. The Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho fighters were defending more than land. They were fighting for the last free hunting territory and a way of life disappearing with every season. Overwhelmed within hours, the cavalry was outnumbered and outmaneuvered, leaving no survivors in the final surrounded position. White marble markers still dot the hillside where soldiers fell, while red granite markers were added later to honour the native warriors who fought and died on the same ground. That struggle for land and survival carries all the way to Buffalo Town, a place that lost its own fight against decline, one closed storefront at a time. It was built around the Great Northern Railroad, and when the trains started skipping it, the town's reason for existing went with them. Crop failures during the Dust Bowl hit the surrounding farms hard, and the families who once kept Buffalo's shops, bank and community hall running simply packed up and left. The buildings didn't disappear though. The bank still stands, the community hall still holds its shape, and the storefronts still face a main street that nobody really uses anymore. Garnet pushes that idea further. A remote mountain settlement so well preserved, you can still walk through homes, hotels, and mineworks of a community that vanished almost overnight. At its busiest, it was a full working town tucked into the mountains, with a hotel, a school, a jail, and enough saloons to suggest the miners weren't spending all their earnings on groceries. Winter here was not a season so much as a siege. Snowdrifts buried the lower structures, cut off supply routes for weeks, and turned a profitable mining camp into a survival exercise. Miners who stayed through winter often ran out of basic supplies before the roads cleared, some years waiting well into spring just to get resupplied. Fire tore through the settlement twice, which is partly why the surviving buildings feel so oddly intact. What stands today is simply what the flames missed. The Bureau of Land Management now maintains garnet specifically because without intervention, the forest would quietly reclaim it. From a mountain town frozen in its final hour, we dropped down to the Yellowstone River, where Livingston grew into everything garnet never had the chance to become. Railroad expansion put this place on the map almost overnight, turning a river crossing into one of southern Montana's busiest transfer points for supplies and travellers bound for Yellowstone. The depot built here was far grander than a town this size had any right to expect. Designed to impress park-bound travellers the moment they stepped off the train, and it still stands today. Livingston also sits in one of the windiest corridors in the northern Rockies, where gusts regularly flip trucks on the interstate just outside of town. Beyond it, the current leads straight into the Absaroka-Beartooth wilderness, where the elevation climbs, the trees thin out, and the mountain takes full control. One of the largest roadless areas in the lower 48, this granite plateau sits so high that summer snowstorms are routine, and hikers often cross what would be summits elsewhere in the Rockies. Weather shifts fast here. A clear morning can turn into a full whiteout by afternoon, with little terrain offering shelter once it does. Where the Beartooth granite gives way to older, darker rock, the Absaroka range begins, a volcanic chain that cuts a harder, sharper profile across the skyline. These mountains are built from volcanic material rather than pushed-up granite, giving the terrain a crumbling, unstable quality that makes it looser and more unpredictable than it looks. Landslides here are common enough to reshape trails between seasons, and whole sections of hillside occasionally let go without much warning. Some sections erode faster than vegetation can establish itself, leaving wide patches of bare dark rock that give the range its distinctly brooding look. Living in that wind-scraped exposure is the white-tailed ptarmigan, a bird that never leaves, just changes colour with the seasons, and waits out whatever the mountain throws at it. In summer it's speckled brown and grey, merging into rocky slopes. In winter it turns pure white, vanishing into the snow so well predators often walk right past it. That colour change happens feather by feather over several weeks. Essentially a full wardrobe swap, twice a year. It also grows thick feathers across its feet in winter, turning them into built-in snowshoes that keep it moving across powder without sinking. When temperatures drop hard, it burrows directly into the snow and stays there, using the snowpack as insulation, the same way an igloo works. Predators like hawks and foxes are a constant threat, but the ptarmigan's best defence has always been stillness. Moving first is usually the mistake that gets it caught. Back on the open plains, the Milk River Valley Church stands exactly where someone decided to build a church, far from everything, and then everyone quietly stopped coming. Churches like this weren't built for towns, but for the spaces between them, where farming families made long Sunday wagon rides across open prairie just to meet. When the surrounding farms emptied out during the long agricultural decline, the congregations didn't dissolve so much as shrink below. The number needed to keep the doors open. The building still stands largely intact, paint fading and pews still inside. Unlike most prairie churches that collapse or get stripped for lumber, this one has simply been left alone. That thread of faith, farmland and community didn't disappear. It just moved, and St. Ignatius carries it on, where tribal history and church life have run side by side for generations. St. Ignatius sits on the edge of the Flathead Indian Reservation, where ranch land and quiet homesteads meet one of the largest protected tribal areas in the American West. Irrigation water drawn from the Mission Mountains turned dry foothill grassland into productive fields that still run today, which is the only reason a town like this exists here at all. The Salish and Kootenai people were here long before the settlement, and their presence never faded, staying woven into the land, governance and character of the community. At the centre stands St. Ignatius Mission, a towering church that has watched the town grow, shrink and endure as one of Western Montana's most recognisable religious landmarks. The structure was built almost entirely by hand, using bricks fired directly on site, a slow process that gave it its lasting weight and presence. Inside, more than 100 murals line the walls and ceilings, painted by a self-taught mission cook who fused Catholic imagery with distinctly native visual elements. Built on Salish land with Salish labour, the mission carries a legacy of cultural suppression that still lingers, even as Salish and Kootenai communities have reclaimed it on their own terms. Down south of those mountains, in the high country leading toward Yellowstone, a different kind of community rose up out of nothing. Big Sky wasn't built like most towns. It was designed as a resort destination, carved into a mountain valley that previously had no permanent settlement at all. The ski area here is one of the largest in North America by skiable terrain, meaning on a quiet weekday, you could ski all day and never take the same run twice. What made it possible wasn't just snow, it was a television personality who turned an empty cattle valley into a global destination. The resort economy created a strange split, where seasonal workers and world-class skiers share the same zip code, one working the lifts, the other riding them. Looming over all of it is Lone Mountain, the summit that defines Big Sky's skyline and pulls skiers and hikers onto some of the steepest accessible alpine terrain in the northern Rockies. It got its name the obvious way. It rises above the valley as a single isolated summit, standing apart from every surrounding ridgeline. The upper runs are considered some of the most challenging lift-served slopes in the region, where skiing starts to feel more like controlled falling. Winter at the summit barely resembles the village below. Winds can shut down the tram entirely, and temperatures can swing wildly between base and peak within the same hour. What sets Lone Mountain apart from most resort peaks is how exposed the upper terrain is. No tree cover, no windbreak, just open alpine rock and snow that behaves exactly as it pleases. Just below those heights where the pines close back in and the noise of the resort fades, Ussel Falls drops through a quiet canyon, a completely different world from everything above it. The canyon stays noticeably cooler than the surrounding forest even in midsummer, creating a microclimate that attracts different wildlife from the sun-exposed slopes just minutes away. Spring snowmelt transforms the falls so completely, louder, faster, far more powerful, that returning visitors sometimes think they've taken a wrong trail. Out on the open snowfields beyond the canyon, the snowy owl hunts in silence, a pale winter visitor that arrives uninvited and moves across frozen ground like it owns the place. Unlike most owls, it hunts in full daylight, a necessary habit for a bird raised in the Arctic, where the sun barely sets for months at a time. Pure white plumage acts as camouflage on open ground, allowing a surprisingly large bird to disappear against the snow until it shifts. Instead of building nests, the female scrapes a shallow hollow in the frozen tundra, laying eggs in the open and keeping them warm with only her body heat. Pairs stay loyal for the season, not forever. They return to the same breeding grounds each year, and if both survive winter, they simply pick up where they left off. When food runs low in the far north, snowy owls surge south in eruptions, turning Montana's snowfields into temporary hunting grounds far from where they usually live. Some winters bring several, other winters none at all, which makes every sighting feel slightly unearned and completely unforgettable. Out near the old smelter town of Anaconda, you'll find a perfect western street that looks like it stepped right out of a movie. Gunslinger Gulch is a preserved frontier streetscape built to turn Montana's long-souled frontier mythology, dating back to early railroad travel posters, into something you can walk through. Saloons, jailhouses and storefronts line the set, arranged to keep that outlaw-era image alive in physical form rather than just memory or legend. What makes it stranger than a typical tourist stop is how seriously it's played. Staged shootouts, period costumes, and mock standoffs delivered straight, no wink to the crowd. The outlaw history is real enough. The territory saw some of the West's most active vigilante justice, with gangs operating openly until citizens took matters into their own hands. From performed history to lived history, Moccasin sits quietly in the wheat country, a former railroad stop where the buildings outlasted the business that filled them. The Milwaukee Road made it an agricultural stop where grain farmers could load, fuel and resupply, and at its peak it ran on just a bank, general store and gas station. Modern trucking changed the math entirely, letting farmers bypass small depot towns and ship directly, making Moccasin's entire reason for existing quietly redundant. The wheat fields never stopped producing. It's the infrastructure around them that emptied out, leaving active farmland wrapped around a town running on momentum. Down the same rail line, Ingomar picks up where Moccasin leaves off. A windblown former depot where the buildings are still standing, but the people largely aren't. Ingomar once handled livestock shipping, grain loading, and enough daily foot traffic to keep a post office and school running without question. When the Milwaukee Road collapsed in one of America's largest railroad bankruptcies, towns like Ingomar lost the network that once kept trade, movement, and daily life flowing. Jersey Lily Bar, a saloon that's kept running through it all, still serves its unchanged bean soup to travellers who drive out just for the experience. Back in the Central Mountains, surrounding the state capital, lies one of the most historically significant forests in the country. Lewis and Clark pushed through this exact country, and hikers today are sometimes walking the same ground the expedition crossed when it had no idea what came next. The forest shifts by elevation. Dry grassland below, dense conifers mid-slope, alpine meadows above, while limestone beneath hides cave systems most people never suspect. Recent wildfires have reshaped large sections, and the mix of burned snags and fresh growth left behind is now some of the most productive wildlife country in the forest. That story peaks at the Missouri River, where the gates of the mountains squeeze the water between canyon walls so dramatic, Lewis stopped mid-journey to write about them, and they look the same today. The walls shoot nearly straight out of the water, and from a boat at the bottom, the sky shrinks to a narrow strip above your head. Lewis named this place convinced the canyon would never end, but within a few bends it opened completely, as if the mountain had simply let them through. The Blackfeet had known this passage long before any expedition arrived, and to them it wasn't a landmark, it was a boundary, where the open plains ended and something else began. Far up on the northern plains near the Canadian border, a tiny settlement called Glentana barely shows up on most maps. A tornado tore through here, leaving damage the town never fully repaired, and a 2-story school still stands by the roadside, empty, weathered, and much too big for the few people left. Here, winters are brutal. Temperatures can plunge to extreme cold, and the nearest town with a hardware store or doctor is a long, exposed drive away. That isolation built slowly. Decades of drought, falling farm income, and young people leaving for cities quietly drained places like Glentana of the population that once kept them going. Not every Montana story is about survival. Some are about spectacle, and Yellowstone delivers that in a way few places on the planet can match. This is the world's first national park, sitting on top of one of the largest active volcanic systems on Earth. More than half of the world's geysers are packed into this one park, some firing on a near-perfect schedule for as long as anyone has been watching. The heat doesn't just put on a show, it feeds entire ecosystems, with microbes living in the boiling pools that scientists study as a model for what life on other planets might look like. Below the surface, geothermal heat shapes the land above, keeping parts of the park snow-free in winter and drawing bison and elk to those open patches when everything else is buried. Wildlife viewing has become so consistent that an entire economy has formed around it. Photographers, guides, lodges, and tour operators all relying on predictable animal movement. Most of the action concentrates in a few valleys, where generations of animals have learned that people are mostly loud and mostly harmless. The best of those valleys is just ahead. Lamar, where wolves, bison, bears, and elk share an open stage wide enough to watch the whole drama unfold at once. People call it America's Serengeti, and it earns that name. Wildlife moves here in the open, in daylight, in numbers that make most national parks look empty. Wolf watchers pull off the road before sunrise, set up spotting scopes in the cold, and wait for a pack to make a move. And the packs almost always do. Bison calves born in spring become targets within days, and the valley turns into a live predator-prey classroom no documentary can fully prepare you for. Grizzlies work the valley floor too, sometimes feeding just a few hundred yards from the road, close enough to watch without binoculars. Most predators avoid open ground, but Lamar's flat floor and wide sightlines mean hunters and hunted are fully visible to each other, and to everyone watching from the roadside. Then the valley eventually gives way to something louder. waterfalls, yellow canyon walls, and a river that clearly has somewhere to be. The Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone wasn't carved by slow erosion. It was weakened by volcanic heat from below, letting the river cut through it far faster than a normal one would form. First comes the Upper Falls, a sharp, powerful drop that most visitors underestimate until they're standing next to it and can't hear anything else around them. Downstream, the lower falls plunges nearly twice the height of Niagara, its impact rolling outwards so strongly it feels like it moves through the body. Colour in the canyon walls comes from hydrothermal activity, cooking the rock into shades of yellow, orange and red, a slow geological process that never fully stopped. Early visitors refused to believe what they were seeing and came back multiple times convinced their eyes were playing tricks. The colours don't look natural because technically they aren't. Along the rim, trails run dangerously close to the edge, where only a railing separates visitors from a sheer drop that has challenged park safety since the earliest years. Farther along, the canyon suddenly breaks open. Within a few miles, the walls flatten, the roar fades, and the river settles into something almost quiet. That shift from violent to calm draws a different kind of visitor downstream, one that travels thousands of miles to rest in the shallows and barely makes a sound doing it. Among the most elegant of those travellers is the tundra swan, passing through Yellowstone's still ponds and wet meadows on one of the longest migratory routes of any bird. These swans fly thousands of miles between Arctic breeding grounds and wintering waters, twice a year, every year, without a map. Weighing up to 20 pounds, they still lift off the water with a running start that looks more like a small plane than a bird. They mate for life, travel together on migration, and if one falls behind, the other waits. On the water, movement becomes synchronized, necks dipping in rhythm as they feed across the shallows. Their calls carry over a mile. A flock in full voice sounds less like birds and more like a distant stadium crowd. In Yellowstone, they find a brief pause in that journey, resting in geothermally warmed wetlands surrounded by bison and bears, completely unbothered by the setting. For them, the calm shallows function only as a stopover, enough time to feed, recover strength, and continue south. When the swans leave, the ponds go quiet and the focus turns to small settlements beyond the park, like Mildred, a Yellowstone trail stop that once flourished and now shows its decline on every weathered wall. In its day, this town hosted wrestling matches, dances, basketball games, and spelling bees in a single town hall that doubled as the social centre for half the county. Today, most of the buildings sit silent. A few patched up houses, a repurposed church, and a handful of holdouts keep the place from disappearing entirely. Unlike most ghost towns, Mildred refuses to give up. Slow, stubborn, half asleep, with a few Saturday night lights still glowing in scattered homes. Down in the Deer Lodge Valley, the same valley where the Cattle King once raised his herds, stands a stone fortress built to hold the worst men Montana could produce. The old Montana State Prison went up as the mining camps exploded. Where there's fast money, there's fast crime, and the territory needed somewhere to put the men who didn't know when to stop. Inmates quarried and cut the sandstone walls themselves, which means the men locked inside had personally built the place they couldn't escape. Conditions were severe enough that riots broke out more than once. The most violent left guards dead, inmates in control of the yard, and a hostage situation that made national news. The prison also ran a working ranch and a license plate factory, keeping inmates busy and the institution partly self-funded, practical, and just a little strange. Ghost hunters have come for years, convinced the cell blocks and death row hold something that never left, and even in daylight, the place has that effect on people. It's a museum now, and visitors can walk the same cell blocks, yard and solitary units that once held Montana's most dangerous. The orders that filled these cells came from Helena, a city that grew from a gold camp into a capital and never looked back. Gold was discovered here by 4 prospectors who almost didn't stop, and within years that gulch became one of the wealthiest cities per capita in the country. At its peak, Helena had more wealth than almost anywhere else in the country, as miners struck gold and quickly traded pickaxes for mansions. Most gold rush towns burned bright and disappeared, but Helena took the money and built banks, schools, and government institutions before the gold ran out. Two earthquakes rattled the city decades apart, and each time it repaired, rebuilt, and kept going. The kind of stubbornness that tends to produce state capitals. Helena even beat out Anaconda for permanent capital status in a heated campaign of bribery claims, newspaper wars, and a public vote that split Montana nearly in half. That fight ended in one building, the Montana State Capitol, sitting at the top of the city as a declaration that Helena won and had no intention of letting anyone forget it. The building took longer and cost more than planned, a pattern in government construction that Montana apparently started early. The copper dome wasn't part of the original design. It was added later, which feels fitting for a state that built its entire economy on copper mining. Inside, the walls are covered in Charles Russell murals, buffalo hunts, indigenous life, and open plains that no longer look quite the same. On the front lawn stands a bronze horse and rider of Thomas Francis Meagher, former territorial governor of Montana, funded by public donation and unveiled to a crowd of over 1,500 on the 4th of July, 1905. A few blocks away, the Cathedral of St. Helena rises higher than anything else in the capital city. Its twin spires climb well past the Capitol dome, built by a congregation that wanted to make absolutely clear the church had arrived and wasn't leaving. Modelled after the votive church in Vienna, it reflects an unexpected ambition for a former gold camp in the American West to build itself something drawn straight from European royalty. Stained glass windows crafted in Munich and shipped across an ocean and a continent were installed in a city that barely existed a generation earlier. An earthquake cracked the structure so badly it raised doubts it would stand. But instead of tearing it down, the congregation spent decades quietly raising money to restore it. Gold brought people here, stubbornness kept them, and what they built, from prison walls to cathedral spires, canyon viewpoints to cattle ranches, turned a territory no one expected to last into one no one forgets. This is Montana, a land of hidden wonders and remarkable architectural marvels. Now, if you don't want to miss the most unreal wonders of Mississippi Delta, check out this video.